Welcome back to The Hardline. I'm John Bachman. A lot of speculation about Hillary Clinton's possible vice presidential pick. How much will it really matter? When it comes to Hillary Clinton's game of vice presidential pick'em, everyone's a strategist.
She has this checklist of possible traits she would like to see in a running mate.
I think the other thing she could try to do would be to pick off a key state. Yeah. Ohio is central to both parties. For her in particular, Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, comfortably liberal. The Bernie Sanders crowd would probably be happy with him.
I think the one that makes the most sense is Tim Kaine, unless she thinks she's in political trouble.
Swing states are all the rage in modern elections, but the ultimate case of a Veep Stakes geography win? John F. Kennedy picking Lyndon Johnson to appeal to Southern voters. How about a different generation and race? Yes, someone to complement Clinton with contrast.
I've heard a variety of names, including Cory Booker, Helio Castro.
From Tom Perez to Julian Castro.
But there are cautionary tales tied to splashy VP picks based on demographic contrast, like gender, when Walter Mondale chose Geraldine Ferraro to be the first female ever on the ticket. But that was then, and now gender is a thing again in the Democratic Veep Stakes.
So Elizabeth Warren, who would bring some electricity to the ticket, although two women is complicated demographically.
And while it's fun to guess until the pick is actually made,
well, I don't know who she's actually planning to pick.
The winner of the Democratic Veep Stakes is still anyone's guess. Another example of contrast that worked when President Bill Clinton picked Al Gore to be his vice presidential nominee. Al Gore, of course, a senator at the time. Clinton needed somebody who was thought of as a Washington insider. My, how things have changed. Back to you, Ed.
Never before in the history of these United States, at the very least never before that anyone alive can recall or the history books point out, have we found ourselves mere weeks prior to a major party candidate being named to contest the White House, the other major party candidate right on those heels, and been faced with more duplicity, underhanded dealing, flat-out lies, ridiculous comparisons, issues of national security being compromised, and a voting population being forced to confront what in Star Trek lore has come to be known as the Kobayashi Maru scenario. The no-win scenario, where no matter who becomes president, a good portion of this nation will be biting their collective tongues so hard that resounding snap sound will be deafening when someone steps up to take the oath of office. Let history be our guide here. Let it be completely fair. There may be nothing history can do to ensure this scenario plays out any differently than what many of us fear. Let us then welcome back the New York Times bestselling author of Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan, noted presidential historian, the man who has more presidential historic knowledge than any Starfleet computer bank. Had to get the reference in there, Craig Shirley. Craig, always a pleasure, my friend, to get a chance to talk with you. Hey, now I brought up the no-win scenario here. In your knowledge, looking at the history of presidents, have we ever been faced with this really hold-your-nose, no-win scenario at this level before?
Boy, you know, Ed, I have racked my brain. I've gone back and I've gone through books and websites and things like that. The most recent I can refer to that I can bring up is 1968 with the contest between Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace. All of them had high negatives. None of them were particularly well liked. You got to remember, Hubert Humphrey became liked and respected in the years after he was vice president. But in 1968, he had Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson draped all over him, so he wasn't very popular. And of course, he backed into the nomination in 1968. So I think, and of course, 68 was a horrible year in the history of the American Republic, and much like 2016, with bad economy, the world at war, uncertainty in Washington. A national consciousness and doubt. So I think the most recent, closest example I can come up with, Ed, is 1968.
Let me bring up Barry Goldwater's name, because in the last couple of days, well, we've heard this before, but last couple of days, more polls are out telling us that Donald Trump is so hated. No one has been hated as a presidential candidate in recent history other than Barry Goldwater. They keep making that reference here. For those who were not alive at the time, who may not understand, give us a really brief idea here. Why was Barry Goldwater hated so much?
Well, because he broke the old mold. Ed, is that the Republican Party from the time of the 1930s up until 1964 had almost always nominated a moderate insider, whether it was Dwight Eisenhower, whether it was Tom Dewey. Goldwater comes along and stages a populist rebellion. He comes out of the West. He's culturally different. He's ideologically different. He's politically different. And he takes over the party. In fact, he said it in 1960 at the Chicago Convention, which nominated Richard Nixon. He gave a national speech, and he says to conservatives to grow up, because I think we could take over this party in 4 years. And 4 years later, they did. The insiders didn't like it, and they walked on Barry Goldwater. Everybody from George Romney to Nelson Rockefeller, they all walked on Barry Goldwater. The only two candidates, the only two national Republican figures who didn't walk on Barry Goldwater were Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, both of whom went on to become president of the United States. So there's something to be said for party loyalty.
Let's talk about that hate on the other side of things. Hillary Clinton. Of course, if it wasn't for Donald Trump, she would be historically the most hated presidential candidate we've seen in our lifetimes. There's now that feeling, and what has happened with the FBI, with the whole email scandal issue, that Hillary Clinton is above the law, and that she believes she is above the law and she cannot be touched. In your recollection, is there anybody that you can think of that had this sort of arrogance before they even had the nomination locked up?
Boy, that is again a tough one, Ed. I think we're charting new territory in 2016. It remains to be seen. People are so cynical about Washington. They believe that the fix is in. They believe that the elites operate by a two set of rules, one for the rest of the population and a second set of rules for the insider elites. She may have won the battle in Comey, letting her spit the hook, as the Clintons are wont to do. But she may have lost the war, because this creates just more bitterness and more cynicism on the part of the American people. So it remains to be seen. But I can't imagine that. I mean, she doesn't escape from this unscathed, at least politically. Maybe legally she does, but but politically she does not. It remains to be seen. But I think that there's still a lot of steps to be played out before she can be declared in the clear.
That I will agree on. 90 seconds left. Let's turn to vice president's roles here. At the Aspen Ideas Festival, Newt Gingrich, who's being talked about as a potential vice presidential candidate for Donald Trump, he talked about the potential of being the Veep and what role he would serve if offered the position. Interesting. Here's what he said.
My working assumption is, and again, Cliff and I have to talk a lot of this out in detail, because it really messes up your life. I mean, you're going on. We have a lot of fun things we're doing. We're about to launch a movie on women in the American Revolution, and we're doing a bunch of other things. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, no, why don't you go over there? So I have a very simple test question. If it's about funerals, I'm not interested.
Which is, I love it when he said that out loud, because a lot of people feel that way. Now, today, Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee has said he's out as a potential running mate. That still leaves in Christie, Gingrich, Pence, Sessions, Ernst. 30 seconds to you here, my friend. Is this really that important, whomever the vice president's going to be for Donald Trump? Honestly.
Absolutely. And it is vitally critical. It means whether or not Trump is going to put together a united convention and go on to compete in the fall, or whether or not he's going to create a divided convention and go on to lose in the fall. There are certain candidates who are divisive, like Trump is. Let's face it, he's divisive like Goldwater. And Goldwater chose an equally divisive running mate in the form of Congressman Bill Miller. He said at the time the reason he picked Miller was because he ticked off Lyndon Johnson. Actually, he used stronger language than that, but I can't use it because this.
No. That's okay. It still is a family show from time to time. We get it.
A family show.
10 seconds. Go.
But Goldwater produced a divided convention. If Trump is smart, he'll go for a united convention like a Newt Gingrich type character or individual who will unite the party.
If he lets anybody talk to him, that's the next question, and tell him what to do. We're all out of time, unfortunately. Craig Shirley, thanks so much for joining us, my friend. We'll do it again next week. Rock on, true believers. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow night right back here. Good night.